This is home to retired couple Peter and Maya Welton, busy doing nothing as they enjoy their retirement. But on a summer's afternoon in 2009, their peace was rudely shattered.
We just heard this almighty noise. It sounded as if my kitchen cupboards were coming off the wall.
The noise had come from the roof. Within minutes, Peter found himself scrambling up his ladder to investigate.
Good heavens above. My granddaughter was behind me, and she saw it right there in that corner. She went to touch it. She said, "Grandad, it's too hot."
Bizarrely, what Peter and his granddaughter discovered was a small, solid object that had smashed through their roof.
Over the past few decades, communications have changed at an astonishing rate, and the world is becoming ever more connected. Satellites form a crucial part of the global communications infrastructure, providing us with phone, broadband and TV services. Thanks to satellites, no place on the planet is out of reach. The next generation of wireless communications, 5G, provides the opportunity to seamlessly integrate the advantages of new terrestrial and space technologies.
We live in a satellite-enabled age. You may not be able to see the spacecraft flying above us, but they are the very life support system that we all depend on every day. Earth observation satellites give us a unique vantage point. We can see the health of crops, the height of the sea, even the pattern of the winds. This helps us protect the environment and manage resources. Satellites enable long-term sustainable development and also play a key role in helping us respond to global humanitarian disasters. Communication satellites keep us connected, giving us data on the go anywhere in the world. They're powering a revolution in how we see and share information, helping us to do business, create new networks, and even stay healthy. Global positioning satellites have fundamentally changed the way we navigate and coordinate. There are now thousands of products and services, even entire industries, all relying on accurate location and timing information from space. At the same time, it's getting cheaper to access. A new generation of smaller satellites is going into orbit, packing powerful technology. The cost of launches is coming down. The Internet of Space is coming, a network of connected satellites spanning the Earth. All of this opens up incredible opportunities for business, governments, communities, all of us. This is the new space age, and we're all part of it.
Congratulations, the space community of India. So we have a new launch vehicle.
actually the beginning of the new era of commercial spaceflight from India, because as we already know, there are 3 operational rockets in India. That is the PSLV series of rockets, which is of course one rocket, and besides that, we also have the GSLV series, which is GSLV Mark II and Mark III. But these are all rockets that were designed about 2 or 3 decades ago, and these are launch vehicles meant for medium lift capacity. But the SSLV is a market-centric and Indian industry-centric rocket, because it's something that can be assembled in almost like a week. It's comparable to use layman's terms. If the PSLV and GSLV rockets are more like sedans and SUVs, the SSLV is more like a hatchback. It's something that's meant to get the job done, but it's also meant to get the job done at low cost. And it's also a rocket that can be assembled in about 1 week. It can be deployed very easily. And it's also a rocket that's meant for customers, foreign customers and Indian customers, to provide them low-cost launch services. This is a huge market. We're talking about nearly $500 billion. We're talking about $470 billion to be particular, because that's the size of the global space economy.
We live in an information age. A lot of that information is coming from these things on orbit. One of the things that satellites do is they provide information. There's all sorts of information that now is space-based. So really, we're becoming more and more dependent on these space services and capabilities. There's roughly about 500,000 objects orbiting the Earth right now that humans have put into space. Those things die up there. Most of that stuff never comes back. Every once in a while, 2 of these things will collide with each other and break up and become smaller pieces. There's about 500,000 objects ranging in size from like a speck of paint all the way up to a school bus. And a speck of paint moving at the right speed, colliding against something that actually works, could render it completely useless. But we can't track things as small as a speck of paint. And so these 26,000 objects are in different orbits, going at different speeds, and we can't exactly predict when any 2 of these things might hit each other. We track about 26,000 satellites, and we're gonna add another 20,000 just in the next 5 years. We have very specific lanes. These lanes are becoming more and more crowded. The more stuff we launch and things blow up and collide with each other, we can't track everything. So there are pieces of debris that are hazardous that we have no idea where they're at and where they're going.
The satellite control network allows the satellite operators across the globe to talk to their satellites. They can both send commands to move or direct it to look at something, and they can also receive data back to know that their satellite is working properly, doing what it should be, and where they would like it to be. If there's a satellite anomaly, we are essentially the group that they call, because we can help them contact their satellite no matter where it is in space, whether it's where it should be or it's not where it should be, and they then need to be able to track it and send it commands to try to reacquire that satellite in real time.
Space has never been more accessible than today. Satellites are getting smaller and smaller, and are being produced and launched more frequently at lower costs, thanks to significant advancements in electronics, digital technologies, and manufacturing. As human activity in space continues to grow, so does space debris. This increasing congestion poses significant risks to space infrastructure, safety, and future orbit usability, as well as the services those assets provide to societies.
Have you heard of the Starlink satellites? They are part of SpaceX's mission to bring internet access to remote parts of the world.
60 satellites launch into space on Elon Musk's reusable rocket, Falcon 9. It's part of Starlink, a constellation of low-orbit satellites from SpaceX, promising high-speed internet connection to remote locations around the world. The goal is for that to grow to more than 40,000.
If you imagine the problems we have with space debris and space junk already, that is just adding to it at a rate that we can't keep up. We can't keep up with the risk that creates.
Nice launch trajectory and countdown net. Pad is clear.
10, 9, 8.
Launch auto sequence has started.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Go for launch.
Vehicle is supersonic. Stage separation confirmed. Dragon separation confirmed. Stage 1 is transonic. Landing legs have deployed. And Falcon 9 has landed.
About a month ago, and I found it on Monday. It was about 10 o'clock over there on the side of the hill.
It looks like a, what do you think it looks like if it wasn't?
Well, when I first seen it, I thought it was a loosen mower.
Also, it looks like a dead tree.
Yeah.
So I get lots of reports of space junk, and it's actually usually easy to rule out. What made this one special was the SpaceX Crew 1 trunk was a catalogued object, and it was catalogued known to be going over New South Wales in Australia and re-entering around 7:05 a.m. on Saturday, 9 July. Now, on that time, people heard and saw it. So people heard the sonic boom of it re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, and people saw the bright light and bits breaking off of the object fragmenting as intended. So as you get up close, you can kind of see really subtle detail in all the features. You can see some of the scarring already on this panel. This is due to the heat re-entry. You can start to see cabling, so this is a carbon mesh, and what it's doing is to insulate both around any cabling and any wires. Now, keeping in mind this has to withstand intense heat. Now, firstly, some people think this stuff is radioactive, and it's not. Yes, there is radiation in space. Things don't come back radioactive all of a sudden. And it's also been out in the weather, the rain, the wind for a couple of weeks, so any loose, potentially harmful bits may have blown and washed off.
Another big issue is the burgeoning commercial uses of space. So the existing space debris was largely created by governments. But today, the biggest users of space are becoming commercial companies, and in particular, the large constellations that are being launched. So that is a potential future space debris problem.
Our activities in space have left traces behind, and certain orbits are at risk of becoming congested. About 17,000 man-made objects are currently being regularly monitored from the ground. Some 10,000 of these objects are fragments created by more than 250 explosions and collisions that have occurred in orbit. Explosions are caused by energy reservoirs that remain unused upon completion of a mission. Only 7% of the monitored objects are functioning satellites. The effect has been particularly evident in the low Earth orbit region. This extends to a height of about 2,000 kilometers. 2/3 of all known artificial objects can be found in this comparatively small region. However, also here, they are far from evenly distributed. For most missions, near-polar orbits between 600 kilometers and 1,200 kilometers altitude are used. For this reason, the highest collision risk can be found in the vicinity of the Earth's poles. The Earth's upper atmosphere below these altitudes prevents debris from remaining in space for long periods of time. The objects are slowed down by the atmosphere, causing them to lose height and burn up on re-entry. Orbits above 1,200 kilometers are too far away for Earth observation missions and communication applications. They are therefore used considerably less.
Until 2007, experts tracked around 12,000 large pieces of junk. But since then, two events have caused the situation to degenerate. One involved Cosmos 2251, a Russian satellite in low Earth orbit that suddenly malfunctioned. The Russians could no longer communicate with it, and were unable to deorbit it to Earth. In a perpendicular trajectory at the same altitude, a brand new American satellite called Iridium 33 was in orbit. The impact sent debris flying in all directions. Around 1,000 pieces larger than 3 inches and thousands of smaller fragments were ejected into space, posing a threat to all the devices in low Earth orbit. This collision proves that an out-of-control object in low orbit is a danger to all working satellites. Another event worthy of Star Wars took place when China decided to deliberately destroy a weather satellite that was no longer in use, using a ballistic missile armed with an infrared seeker and a warhead. It was an arrogant show of strength by Chinese authorities, with no concern for the consequences. As a result of these two events, by 2010 there were more than 17,000 large pieces of debris circling the Earth.
When you think of space, you think of just that, space, emptiness, the void. But when it comes to the space around Earth, it's actually not that empty. It's filled with a whole bunch of junk, or space trash. In fact, experts think that there are millions of pieces of debris in orbit, ranging in size from bigger than a softball to smaller than a marble. So what is all of this junk hanging out around our planet? Well, that's the awkward part. It's all our stuff that we've put into space that we just don't use anymore. Sorry, Mom. That can be satellites that are no longer working, leftovers from rockets, or stuff that's come off spacecraft over time, like panels or even flecks of paint. Space debris has included some rather unique items too. There's a tool bag still up there that was lost by an astronaut during a spacewalk. A lipstick-sized capsule of Gene Roddenberry's ashes once orbited the globe for a while too. Even frozen pee used to make the rounds. Before pee recycling systems were put in place, astronauts used to dump their urine out into space, where it immediately turned into beautiful, shiny ice crystals that reflected the sun. Sure, that's lovely and all, but just like trash here on Earth, debris in space can be a big problem. It makes the space around our planet a congested and potentially dangerous place. You may think space debris is just floating out there all slow-like, but this stuff isn't really floating at all. It's actually zooming around Earth at more than 17,000 miles per hour.
All right, bye-bye. Just flies beautifully, and we are monitoring.
So at the moment, there are something on the order of 45,000 objects bigger than 10 centimeters that are routinely tracked by U.S. military, other governments, commercial actors that are just going around the Earth, that are up there as a result of what we've done in space for the last 60 plus years. There's for a satellite operator, the big question is, you launch your satellite into orbit, what risks does it face from these kinds of collisions? And that really depends on what altitude it's in. Space is very, very big. There's lots of room up there. But we tend to put satellites in very similar orbits because some altitudes, some orbits have very unique properties that are good for weather, remote sensing, or other kinds of missions. So the satellites tend to be in, group clustered in very similar locations. And unfortunately, one of the worst of these regions is between 600 900 kilometers, where a lot of the remote sensing satellites exist, as well as some of these new larger constellations. So at the moment, if you are a satellite operator, every once in a while, you will get an email from the U.S. military or from your government that says 3 or 4 days from now, your satellite is predicted to have a close approach to another space object. The probability of collision is 1 in 10,000, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 500. Good luck.
A European ATV supply ship burns up in the atmosphere over a remote part of the Pacific Ocean.
It is not comparable to a gunshot. The energy contained in a 1 centimeter particle hitting a satellite at that velocity roughly corresponds to an exploding grenade. So the consequences of such a hit mean a satellite failure, for larger objects, even satellite destruction and fragment generation, which again then has environmental consequences.
What space debris experts fear most is a chain reaction, where objects break apart in collisions and fragments go on to smash into other objects, creating more debris.
These collisions generate more fragments, and these fragments are candidates for new collisions to come. So follow-on collisions, if you like. And that the largest fear that we have is that we enter in some sort of cascading effect, where one collision triggers the next one. And this is not anything that will happen within a microsecond like in the movie Gravity, but this is something that will set in slowly, hardly noticeable, but unstoppable. Over decades, the frequency of collisions might increase without human influence.
Collision warnings are issued regularly for satellites operating at the critical height in polar orbits. During routine operation, about 10 objects every week come within 2 kilometers of such satellites. In recent years, ESA has had to carry out about 3 collision avoidance maneuvers per year. A particularly critical situation occurred on the 21st of January 2010. The calculated flyby distance to a disused rocket upper stage was only about 50 meters. The probability of a collision was greater than 1 to 80. The maneuver to avoid a collision was only carried out half an orbit before the determined approach epoch and increased the clearance to a safe distance of 130 meters. However, most of the artificial objects in space are uncontrolled and cannot be influenced. This means that the majority of collisions cannot be avoided using such evasive maneuvers. There have already been 4 major collisions in low Earth orbits. The most serious of these collisions was the one between an Iridium satellite and a defunct Cosmos satellite on the 10th of February 2009. Such collisions currently take place about once every 5 years. The more objects accumulate in orbit due to spaceflight activities, the more frequently such collisions are going to occur. In future, more and more collisions with fragments from earlier incidents are going to occur. This collisional cascading effect was already predicted some 40 years ago. The exponential increase in the number of objects is extremely difficult to slow down. If the current number of launches continues and no countermeasures are taken, the collision rate will eventually be 25 times what it is at present. This would make spaceflight in the important low Earth orbits almost impossible.
There's a lot of information that we rely upon especially in this information age where we're trying to push towards transparency, that you can't achieve without satellites. All the different things that you use every day that are provided by some space capability, so you can think to yourself, out of all these things that I use every day, do I want to live without any of these? If nothing changes, space now becomes this junkyard where we can't send satellites up there anymore to do the things that we want them to do. Corporations and countries need to realize that if they continue to behave the way they are behaving, the environment that they want to leverage and exploit will no longer be usable. And so I want people to start realizing that and demand of their own governments transparency in space. Knowledge should be universal, should be universally shared for everybody's benefit. If everybody has eyes on the skies, watching and monitoring stuff all the time, and you know where everything is always, it makes the calculus of behaving maliciously much more difficult.
So the industry is going through an inflection point that you rarely see. 3 years ago, there were 800 satellites operating in LEO. Now there are close to 4,000 satellites operating there. And in the next few years, it'll be close to 50,000 satellites. So the traffic's ramping up dramatically.
Launches are more frequent, and there's a underpinning of lack of regulatory rules. It's still sort of the wild, wild west out there. So what that means is, as companies are launching all these new satellites, they need infrastructure and services to ensure that their businesses are safe, their satellites are safe, and they're operating effectively and responsibly.
The problem that LEO Labs is solving is tracking and knowing where everything is in space that's orbiting the Earth, so that we can allow greater use of space, greater profits to be had in space by the various companies moving into space, and greater security in space.
Today, most of the debris is still caused by accidental explosions due to unused fuel on board. However, the problem can be alleviated by so-called passivation measures. These include depleting unused fuel, venting pressure tanks, and switching off batteries. Collisions can also be prevented if satellites are removed from heavily frequented orbits at the end of their missions while they are still under control. If they are brought down to a height below 600 kilometers, they will only remain in space for about another 25 years before re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. Collisions with a few items of debris remaining in this area are very unlikely. Even if no more launches took place and the space debris situation was left to its own devices, simulations have shown that the number of objects will not decrease but increase. This is caused by cascading collisions between resident objects and fragments of prior collisions. That scenario indicates that the critical density of objects in the low Earth orbits has already been exceeded. Active intervention is the only way to reduce the present critical density to a sustainable level. The active removal of large and uncontrollable objects is a considerable technical challenge associated with high development costs. The effectiveness of the measures particularly depends on careful selection of the target objects, whereby the following 3 criteria must be met: a high collision risk, a large mass, and a long residence time in space.
04 for your green hook, and Bob will take a gauntlet check prior to crossing the Sarge.
004.
The problem of the space debris has to be fixed in 2 ways. First one, we need to stop polluting. And second way, we have to remove the garbage, if you want, the debris.
At ESA's ESTEC Centre in the Netherlands, engineers are developing ED-Orbit, designed to capture an out-of-control satellite and remove it from harm's way. It's being tested using a robot and satellite model.
We use the camera, which is mounted on the smaller robot arm, to reproduce the motion of the satellite around the target satellite that we want to deorbit, to capture. once we are sure we are moving like a single object, we are like, as if we were dancing but without touching it, each other, we can move the robotic arms to grab the launcher adapter ring. So it makes us easy to bring it down to the Earth and destroy it in the re-entry or in the South Pacific Ocean.
Another approach involves using nets to capture space junk.
So the concept is to, let's say, to mimic what the fishermen do on the sea, and so to have a very large net to stay away from our debris and med satellites that is tumbling and moving freely, and then from that distance to keep our net, and you just try to wrap all over your satellites.
Although ED Orbit is still in development, ESA scientists will be closely watching a UK mission remove debris. This will trial the net concept in the coming months, using a test satellite launched from the International Space Station. In the meantime, the priority is to make sure new satellites don't add to the problem.
Launcher Vega made its inaugural flight and joined ESA's family of launchers. In its payload, 7 CubeSats, or nanosatellites. It was the first time ESA was launching such small passengers. They'd been developed by European universities, paving the way for a new era in satellite technology. Today, the potential of nanosatellites is clear to all, from big space agencies to university students. As in consumer electronics, nanotechnology is changing the way we think about satellites.
In order to allow spaceflight to continue without restriction in future, about 5 to 10 of these objects need to be actively removed every year. This is the only way to fully stabilize the space debris population in space. However, there is a long way to go before the first service vehicle can actively remove objects. There are many technical problems to solve. Approaching an uncontrolled target object is a major challenge. This involves the avoidance of collisions with the target and determining its attitude motion. Because the target object is no longer transmitting telemetry data, the position needs to be actively determined from the ground. This requires the use of radar systems. An initial impression of the attitude motion of the object can be gained from Earth using, for instance, the Tyra tracking and imaging radar located in Germany. The final phase of approach requires the use of relative navigation, for which purpose LiDAR or radar systems can be used. The exact attitude can then be determined using a camera. The method that is used to capture the target object can be chosen depending on certain conditions, such as rotation rate, the structure of the surface, and the size of the object. One possible method is to use a robotic arm to grab a suitable element on the surface of the target body, stopping the motion and berthing the object. The motion can be dampened by a clamp, which can then provide a secure frictional connection. Even the casting of a net would be feasible. This would avoid the need for direct contact with the object, which can then be towed away. These different methods permit the use of powerful thrusters. This allows the service vehicle and the target object to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere together in a controlled manner. Controlled re-entry would take place above unpopulated areas and is the ideal solution. If controlled re-entry is not required, other options are available. The object could be removed from the critical region and disposed of at lower altitudes. It would then re-enter the Earth's atmosphere due to natural air drag at a later date. The initial orbit lowering can be achieved, for instance, by solid rocket motors that are attached to the object. They would first stabilize its attitude and remove it independently afterwards. A passive method of lowering the orbital height is also available. The size of the surface can be increased considerably by attaching a sail, which will increase the atmospheric drag and therefore accelerate the orbital descent. Another idea is irradiation with an ion engine. To do this, ions are accelerated to fast speeds by an electrical field. These efficient low-thrust engines are ideal for long, continuous orbital changes. The constant bombardment of ions onto the surface of the target causes a momentum transfer to the object. Direct contact is therefore unnecessary. Before the active removal of objects can start, there are a number of legal issues to resolve.
This is a really important topic for the development of space exploration, actually, and we've got a great panel here because we've got experts in the observation, we've got experts in attempting to capture these objects and bring them down, and also the legislation as well, which is what Peter does. So let's talk about the rules, actually, I think, quickly, because we talked about some of the scary numbers. What are the rules at the moment about space debris? If I want to launch a satellite, do I need to make sure that it has a plan to come back down again? What are the rules in place regarding the stuff that's up there already?
You know, it's amazing. We now have to think about outer space as a limited natural resource. It's kind of counterintuitive. We've grown up thinking that space is vast and infinite. But it turns out that the Earth's orbital environment is now so crowded and congested that the orbital environment itself and the radio frequency spectrum are really limited natural resources. There are a number of guidelines that have been developed over the years by space agencies and which have been implemented by governments. And recently the UN implemented a series of guidelines for space sustainability. But really we need to have a much more concerted effort to develop norms of responsible behavior in space. If I can just give you a brief analogy. Imagine that you take your car out on a freeway and you drive your car until you run out of petrol or until it dies, and then you leave your car right there in the freeway. That's the kind of situation we're facing in outer space right now, and why we need norms of responsible behavior.
And it's legal to do that, right?
Right now it's legal to do that, yes.
Well, a Russian satellite has broken up into more than 100 pieces of debris in orbit, forcing astronauts on the International Space Station to take shelter. The US Space Command, in a statement, said that there were no immediate details on what caused the breakup.
Flight controllers, go for landing. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guidance, go. Control, contact light.
Throughout history, whenever new territories have been discovered, the question of who owns them and what laws apply is raised. Well, outer space is no exception, but who owns and regulates space, and why are space laws necessary?
It started in 1957 with the first launch of Sputnik, shortly followed by the first launch in 1958 of the United States. At that time we were in the Cold War, in the middle of the Cold War, and there was a danger that space would be used for military purposes. There was a competition between the Russians, the Soviet Union, and the United States. And no one knew who would be the first on the moon, for example. So therefore, they both agreed that there should be no sovereignty rights in outer space, and outer space should belong to mankind, to everybody. From then, it was decided that space law should exist. The United States have put their flag there, but at the same time, there was a special act, a law in the United States, specifying the purpose of this flag, saying that this is only a question of pride, but not a sign of sovereignty.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Several nations want to go to the moon independently. The United States, Japan, Russia, China, Europe. This means that 5 different signals will be sent to the moon and come back. Now, and this all within a certain very limited frequency band. If there is no agreement and coordination before, it could well be that somebody will send something to the moon, the other always, and that things will just not happen because there is an interference of frequencies.
Another area of law not covered by the existing treaties is that of intellectual property. This is particularly relevant to the International Space Station, where at the moment developments in research are covered by the law of each participating country. Only European countries are covered by a common law on intellectual property in space.
The space station, the treaty, the International Governmental Agreement, also provides that for certain aspects the nationality will play a role. Meaning if the American moves from the American part to the European part, it's a few meters, the law will change. And you see that this is, of course, very complex, and this really shows the need that we should invent other concepts for ruling
those things in outer space. When the Space Treaty was drafted, all activities were governmental activities. Today, most of the activities are private activities. All telecommunications are almost private today. The launchers are private, and therefore the Space Treaty is not matching anymore the reality.
The way that the current international legal framework exists is that we have these core treaties, like the Outer Space Treaty, that many countries have signed. The treaties say that countries are responsible for authorizing and supervising their space activities, which includes commercial, but the countries are largely free to do that how they see fit. The treaties also say that countries are responsible for all their space objects and potentially liable for any damages that they cause. The key issue is that countries are sovereign. No one can force any country to do anything in space, let alone elsewhere. So we have to find a way to convince these countries that it is in their own interests to clean up space, to be more responsible, to be more sustainable in space. I think the good news is that a lot of countries are recognizing this.
The full name of the agreement is the rather wordy Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies. The document was drawn up by the legal subcommittee of the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which had been established by the United Nations General Assembly shortly after the Soviet Union launched its Sputnik satellite in 1957. The treaty consists of just 17 articles, all of which were intended to be flexible in order to adapt to new advances in space technology. At its core, though, are the key principles that underline all modern space exploration. These include an agreement that all exploration should be done for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, and that nobody has the right to claim celestial bodies as their own, in an attempt to avoid the frenetic imperialism of the 19th century. 107 countries are currently party to the treaty, although another 23 have signed it but not yet completed ratification. Nations subsequently create their own specific legislation, but all of this draws on the 17 principles laid out in the Outer Space Treaty. As a result, space exploration has remained entirely peaceful, for the time being at least.
The bill's sponsors say that this new law is really an evolution in space travel. Going forward, crew members will be required to sign a waiver acknowledging the risks that are associated with space travel. The bill's sponsor in the House, who represents part of Florida's Space Coast, said this is just the first of many pieces of legislation that he believes are going to be necessary due to the changing space industry.
Lots of cheering here in the room. Big hugs. Sunny William coming through in her blue flight suit.
And followed shortly behind by Commander of Starliner Butch Wilmore, now back on the space station, the third visit for both astronauts and the first crewed flight test of the Starliner spacecraft.
If you think about how we get rules in other areas, right? Think about just out on the road, we have rules of the road. Where did those rules come from? Well, before we had laws on the road, people were driving. There were accidents. We slowly figured out what was the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do, and those things then began to solidify into law. And that happens in a lot of systems on Earth, right? We see that happening on the internet. We have norms form as, companies do things. We're like, that's not so great what you did there. Maybe we should get a rule about that and think about how to mitigate that type of damage in the future, which is, to be honest, somewhat effective, right? It helps us to figure things out as we go. In space, though, that's a problem because the stakes are really high. And it's what I call the liability trap, right? Is we don't want to be figuring out liability after the accident in space, because once the accident happens, it's not just those parties that were damaged, it's all the parties operating in that area that were damaged. And so that causes this problem.
Unfortunately, the actual risk and costs are still hard to define. And so for the moment, there isn't anyone that is really, all the governments that are really motivated to clean up this existing debris, because governments are responsible for and still have jurisdiction over their own space debris. So if a piece of United States space debris hits a satellite, the US might be liable. If a piece of Chinese space debris hits a satellite, China might be liable. But we've never had an actual court case or an actual liability claim. So this is all very uncertain.
Giving analogies with air traffic management and space traffic management, and why is space traffic management probably 100 times more complicated than air traffic management is because we don't have a defunct, aircrafts kind of a scenario in airspace. It's easy for us to, kind of understand when to do a maneuver. It's controlled actually. So when you look at space, it's more or less space debris and active satellites, and you don't have a guideline where, you have airspaces. Space, you can't draw boundaries there. It's very difficult for us to, kind of come to a common agreement where each one of us follow the same thing that the world follows, like we follow in the air traffic management basis.
And that word management, which does seem to imply that there is some authority that is asserting rules and asserting some sort of governance structure that tells operators what they can and cannot do in space. And that's what you hear when you hear the word management. That, unfortunately, is not the case. That's not what we have right now. I would suggest that we have space traffic coordination. And this is marked by norms that really allow us to share information so that operators can look around and say, hey, this is what's up there, this is where I can be, this is where I can't be. But that's on an ad hoc basis. So these operators don't have this, centralized management clearinghouse. They have an ad hoc coordinative clearinghouse. But also there's this other thing going on, right? Space is a strategic domain. It is a domain that militaries engage in and that militaries take very, very seriously. And it's somewhat different from other domains in the sense that the military has a real foothold there and a real interest in preserving their power, their ability to do what they want. And so when we turn to space traffic management, when we think about it in terms of safety, this sounds great. We can all hold hands and come together and solve this problem. But now we're engaged with security actors, and that changes the ability of these actors to do what they want. So when you take this up and you go to the international level and you say, let's do a new treaty, well, we run into a problem in that states have, for 20, 30 years now, been very opposed to the development of any new rules in space, right? And this what we call as a diplomatic blockade to some extent affects everything.
It's interesting, in the United States, there is a discussion going on where many people in the United States are very concerned about China and have made claims that China is going to seize control of the moon or space or other space resources. Yet outside of the United States, there's a lot of countries concerned the United States is going to do the same.
Behind this razor-wired fence in Colorado, a highly classified Space Force asset. Under heavy armed guard, this 18-wheeler packed with high-value satellite comms is one of several mobile command centers poised to roll out in the event of a doomsday attack that would target U.S. military satellite control. If you need to, how fast can you move these trucks out?
The specific timelines are classified, but what I can say is a matter of hours.
Thank you. Line up. At the main Space Force Satellite Ops Center, our cameras were the first ever let inside.
Line down.
It's here that they keep watch over America's military satellites and the world's GPS network, operating in an increasingly hostile environment.
It is truly a warfighting domain. Our adversaries are fielding specific weapon systems in the domain, so we need to view it as such.
The Pentagon says Russia and China are the chief adversaries. In November, a Russian satellite targeted and blew up another Russian satellite, creating a massive orbiting debris field. China conducted a similar test in 2007. U.S. commanders believe China has deployed a satellite with a robotic arm to reach out and grab other satellites. And Russia has nesting satellites loaded with offensive weapons. And liftoff. The head of Space Force says U.S. commercial and military satellites are routinely harassed.
Whether it's jamming or harmful interference in the RF spectrum, laser dazzling, cyber attacks, cyber probing and cyber attacks.
Those attacks monitored 24/7 in this classified command center. More than 70% of military satellite communications come through here. Everything from nuclear command and control orders to presidential communications, down to a Coast Guard cutter, a submarine, even tactical units on the ground.
And if they don't have the communications when they need it, things can go seriously wrong.
As the Navy has sailors, the new Space Force has guardians, many with engineering degrees and now training for the new battlefield. The concern, the Pentagon says China is now outpacing the U.S. in launches and modernizing its own space capabilities, building a remote robotic post on the far side of the moon, invisible to U.S. satellites.
If we don't start accelerating our development and delivery capabilities, they will exceed it.
Commanders here worry Beijing and Moscow could one day deploy offensive military weapons in the space between the moon and Earth, an area called cislunar.
We don't want there to be a war in space. We want all of humanity to continue to use all the benefits of space for all of our good. But if others choose to start a war there, we'll be ready.
Nobu, you're from Astroscale from Japan. You're an expert in how to clean up space, how to start to attack this problem. Tell us about what the technologies are at the moment, what the ideas are that we're thinking about.
Peter said the number of the debris has increased to the critical level where the chain reaction of the collision can happen at any near future. So we have to remove large objects now before they get smaller. If they break up, collide, and become smaller, it's really hard to clean up. So we have to remove large objects now. So we are developing technologies, removing satellites, and we're going to have a world-first demonstration next year. And once you go up to the space, there are so many lights, moon, star, Earth, sun, and the debris. You have to identify which debris you want to approach. And you have to approach the debris and sit back behind the debris. But even if you successfully approach the debris is tumbling, rotating. So how you capture this debris? And our satellite will synchronize the motion, dance with the debris, and capture, stabilize, and bring them down to the atmosphere and burn. So that's our solution.
Copy that. That's 20 seconds until execution of capture sequence.
The aim of the first capture was to release the client from the servicer and then recapture it using a magnetic plate.
Servicer and client are locked together by a mechanism called the light band. What we did was unlock this mechanism so that the two could be separated. What we did first was extend the capture mechanism of the servicer to contact the client.
So that was a very close maneuver. So we just gently pushed the client off the magnetic capture mechanism.
And once the two drifted apart for a couple of seconds, we re-extended this capture mechanism.
And then gave the servicer spacecraft a gentle thrust, so a small delta V that moved us forward to capture the client.
We segmented it in two segments. So future debris and existing debris. So future debris which will come in future, most of them will come from constellations, which Oorjaa said. So each company will launch hundreds or thousands of satellites together. And for example, SpaceX is going to launch more than 6,000 satellites. Amazon is going to launch more than 3,000 satellites. OneWeb is going to launch more than 2,000 satellites. And then they know some percentage of their satellite will go defunct in space. And once their satellite go defunct, they have to replenish with new satellites to keep the coverage. To do that, they have to remove the old satellites. So that's our job. So that's the future debris. For existing debris, as the Peter or Jeremy said, there are more than 20,000, 30,000 objects traveling in space. These were mostly littered by the governments because so far space programs were led by governments. So I believe it's government who should pay for the cost. But meanwhile, industry can provide commercially competitive price to lower down the solution of the removal. So it's a kind of a combination with the government. So that's a business model.
What's going to be my question, actually, to Peter about who pays, who's responsible, actually, for the junk that's already up there?
Well, this is the thing. At the moment, or up until recently, there has been no business case to remove debris out of orbit. In the multilateral fora, sometimes we hear calls for, the establishment of some kind of like eco-tax or some sort of levy that will help to pay to clean up space. But these calls are not always enthusiastically received by all countries, particularly those with lots of material up there.
Are you prepared to name the countries with the most amount of material up there?
Well, I think everybody knows the countries with the most material up there. But what I do want to say is that the nature of space activities is changing dramatically.
Now they're all wondering, is it Russia?
Well, you said it, and the US?
And America, okay. But mostly Russia.
So the thing is that the nature of the space environment is changing dramatically. So in the early days of the space age, space activities were dominated by the two superpowers, and there are a few other countries in the Space Club. But there are now many, many more countries that have entered the space arena, and also many more space actors. So the diversity in space actors is now not just geographical diversity, but also diversity in the numbers, in technical capacity, and also we're seeing the venture capital community is becoming a major driver of new space. And so this is where the connection with regulation comes in. We have to somehow achieve a balance between this amazing potential that startups and new space bring to the space arena, and somehow balance that with the burden on the space environment. We can do this in several ways. One is through regulation, but the other is through encouraging responsible development of a sustainable space ecosystem, so that we avoid situations where there are companies that start to deploy systems in space and then go out of business and then leave half-deployed systems up in space that are basically not controlled by anyone.
So what you're talking about is planning into the satellite life plan, its lifespan from the very beginning, its end of life, right? Making sure there's enough fuel and there's a plan for what to do at the end.
Yes, absolutely. And so there is actually, in the existing international legislation, countries that have signed up to the Outer Space Treaty, which is sort of the foundational instrument of international space law. There is an obligation on countries to ensure that they authorize and supervise the space activities of their non-state actors. And so what this means is domesticating that international treaty obligation in national law in terms of licensing and supervision processes, so that companies that deploy satellites dispose them at end of life in a responsible way.
There are a few countries, Japan, the United Kingdom, the European Union, that have started to put money into removing some space debris, but it is very early stage. And these are essentially demonstration missions to go remove one or two relatively small pieces of debris to prove the technology. And then maybe after that, there would be more work to do that. Should also note that China is the first country I know of that has actively removed a dead satellite from orbit. They had a satellite called SJ-21 that last year went to the geostationary region of Earth orbit, docked with a dead Beidou satellite, and towed it out to the graveyard region. We don't know why they did it, or we don't know. They didn't really talk about it at all. There hasn't been a lot of public discussion about it, but it happened. And there's hope that more countries will do the same. But this is going to cost them quite a bit of money, and for the moment, none of them really want to spend that money.
On January 22nd, Chinese satellite SJ-21 showed up missing from its previous orbit slot. For a few days prior, it had conducted proximity operations with Compass G2, a defunct Chinese navigation satellite. An immediate local search failed, and use of the full exoanalytic global telescope network was authorized to regain custody. 72 hours before the no-show event, SJ-21 and Compass G2 are in close proximity while EXO's sites in Australia make routine collects. Notice the absence of collects during local daytime. The maneuver you will see occurs in the daytime gap, which results in the no-show condition. After the apparent docking of SJ-21 to Compass G2, SJ-21 performs a large maneuver, raising the orbit 3,000 kilometers above GEO. EXO rapidly reacquired SJ-21 using our real-time network C2 and data analytics software in a fast-turn closed loop. For a few days, SJ-21 appeared to be functioning as a space tug, drifting westward with Compass G2 nearly 22 degrees per day. Then on January 26, SJ-21 released Compass G2 and maneuvered back near GEO. We continue to track SJ-21 and monitor it for conjunctions against all known space objects.
The idea of space traffic management in the realm of safety is one that we kind of all acknowledge. We know that this is needed for commercial actors. We know it's needed for state actors. At the same time, when it touches on national security, it changes the dynamic of any negotiation. And we just have consistently seen at the international level that states aren't really interested in coming to the table to negotiate any type of new treaty, and are really reluctant even to come to the table to talk about, normative mechanisms that fall below a treaty. So I would not predict that in the near future we see any legal movement at the international level. I do think that coordinative things will probably continue to kind of trudge along just out of necessity, but I wouldn't hold my breath on the law.
So my question is this. If we're not going to have international law, is there hope that we're going to have some business model that's going to motivate people to get up there and find a way to get the debris out? I mean, it seems a little bit like cleaning up this plastic trash in the middle of the ocean. Everybody agrees it needs to be done, but nobody sees a business model that works. Is there some fantasy we can dream up, some way that we might?
So there is a term called orbit carrying capacity. So when we launch more and more number of satellites, at one point in time, you can't use that orbit anymore once it's filled. It's like you're taking a box and filling it with balls, and then it's done. So you can't add more satellites to that particular orbit. At that point in time, maybe I'm not certain about this. Maybe insurance companies may have something to do with this.
Oh.
One of the things that we're actually working on is trying to develop something that we call orbital carrying capacity to orbital highways. And I think the best way to think about it is, when do you know this capacity is exhausted or saturated? When our decisions and actions can no longer prevent bad things from happening. So if we're trying to do everything possible to avoid things colliding with each other, and we can't help but see those things happen, by all intents and purposes, that orbit is no longer able to provide us with the benefits that we intended. I predict with absolute certainty, if our behavior doesn't change, there will be orbital highways, and we're just going to see an increasing amount of undesirable outcomes occur.
I just want to say we need to break the cycle.
Yeah.
Lawyers are waiting for technology to be demonstrated that you can actually remove something before they dare to put a tougher regulation into their national legislation. And of course, this cycle needs to be broken, and we need to demonstrate it in space. And
I suppose that's kind of ESA's job, right?
We need to make a step now
Yeah.
that will demonstrate the technology is there.
And we hope that then regulators take on board, for example, a regulation that makes the use of a removal service mandatory as soon as you fail to remove your spacecraft with its own mean. And that would automatically generate the market that Nobu was talking about.
Nobu, how long before we see you flying a mission that's going to go and grab a bit of space junk?
So it took 7 years to develop this technology, and now we are talking with the regulatory bodies to have a best practice and identify the safety level, and we are collaborating a lot. I think over the next 7 years, the space debris removal will be just a routine work. Nowadays, we got so many media attentions, but in 7 years, we are just every day, we are just sweeping the space, just silently. That's the day I want.
What a wonderful image.
Now imagine sitting at home and you hear a loud boom. Then you discover something had crashed into your roof, blew through the floor, finally lodging into your bedroom wall. Well, it just happened to one homeowner, and as Stephen Fabian reports, the flying object came from outer space.
A mysterious object falls from the sky. You can hear the impact when it crashes into a home. Look at the damage it caused. A hole from the roof straight through the floor.
It's either space junk or space meteorite. It's 50-50.
So what was it? Turns out it was space junk from the International Space Station.
Maybe I don't have a shield. What? Yeah, I don't have a shield. Where is it? Oh, it's right by the radiator. Maybe at half a foot a second, and one looks like straight paint from the radiator angle.
We copy and we see it.
That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Think of the endless cruelties visited by the inhabitants of one corner of this pixel on the scarcely distinguishable inhabitants of some other corner. How frequent their misunderstandings, how eager they are to kill one another, how fervent their hatreds. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit? Yes. Settle? Not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience. There is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known.